Thank you all for coming this morning. We're very excited to be here to be introducing our 5-year strategic plan. Before I get into that, I would like to just take you back in time for a moment to remember this waterfront was not all that long ago in the span of our history, an industrial, inaccessible, unpleasant location that no one really thought of as a locus for revitalization. And it remained industrial, underutilized, really up until the early 2000s. And here you see one of the sites along the lakeshore that we call the East Bayfront site, with some of its waterfront warehouses before redevelopment began. During this time, other cities had already begun to discover the value of using waterfronts to revitalize and rebrand themselves. New York, London, Barcelona all undertook varying degrees of initiatives to leverage the special qualities of the waterfront to kind of put themselves back on the map in a new way. And this is at the same time as the previous photo that I showed you. Finally, in 1999, Toronto decided to jump in, and here you see the announcement of the creation of Waterfront Toronto by all 3 levels of government. This was a historic moment to bring together different political forces to point at each other and wave at each other and make funny smiles with the CN Tower in the background. But the significance of this can't really be understated. All 3 governments contributed $500 million each towards the effort to revitalize and entrusted Waterfront Toronto with coming up with plans, finding common ground with the community, and working with all the many agencies and stakeholders that oversee this waterfront. Part of the reason it laid undeveloped for so long is how complex it is to work here physically in terms of the soil conditions, but also the politics of working on the waterfront. And the creation of Waterfront Toronto wasn't simply to get us started on rebuilding. We had a public mandate to really transform the industrial lands into great neighborhoods and to support both economic vitality as well as enhance quality of life. And our mandate has all of those aspects built into it, which was in part a reaction to some of the previous efforts to revitalize that were seen as too focused on economics or too focused on culture. Ours was really supposed to balance all of those objectives. It is one of the largest waterfront revitalization projects going on in North America. We are working on about 850 acres of landfill. That blue line you see there represents about 2,000 acres of land. It's huge. And just to give you a sort of rough scale comparison, if that's our designated waterfront area, we are considerably larger than some of the more well-known revitalization projects that are going on around the world, including the Hudson Yards project, which gets lots of media attention, but is considerably smaller than what we're trying to do, which also means what we're trying to do has a much longer time horizon. So, we're responsible for doing 3 things in our role. We are the catalyst and steward for Waterfront. So as steward, we have a responsibility to the public, to the residents, to stakeholders, to community groups to make sure that we are building this waterfront for everybody, which means it has to be accessible to everybody, but also everyone has an opportunity to provide input and help shape the outcomes of what we're doing. And the catalyst speaks to the fact that the entire waterfront revitalization is probably a multi-billion dollar effort, and it cannot all be done by government, can't all be done by one entity. So we have to pick and choose our interventions such that they spark other spin-off activities. So we have been focused on building public realm, building public infrastructure that then attracts the private sector to the waterfront so that they can redevelop, and you'll see some of that in a moment. We're also the revitalization lead, and in that role, we help dispose of public land. So there is a very large amount of city-owned land, there's some provincially owned land, there's even a little bit of federally owned land. As a revitalization lead, we're responsible for master planning that property, but then also bringing those pieces out to market. And so we have led several developer proposal calls that have brought in a wide range of private sector partners, and that's something we continue to do, both in terms of real estate, but also in terms of innovation and sustainability. And then the third role is that of a partner. Once we've procured our development partners, we do effectively form partnerships with them. We work very closely with them to make sure that the projects that they have initially proposed go through a very rigorous review process and end up delivering on what we promised. And I think that's something that's really led the public to trust Waterfront Toronto. We say we're going to do something, and when we're finished, we have generally delivered something that's what we said we were setting out to do. So, what have we set out to do and what have we done? A lot of things have been happening over the last 15 years, and it's actually somewhat amazing when you start looking back. Think about that photo I showed you from 2000 where there was nothing in the West Donlands. This is about an 80-acre site. Waterfront Toronto led all the master planning for this, and it was the precinct plan that we had prepared that enabled this to host the Pan Am Games in 2015. Attracted a great development partner in Dundee Kilmer. Hosted 10,000 athletes during the Pan Am Games, and we now have over half a dozen buildings here that are occupied. There's a thriving neighborhood starting. There's a whole retail commercial hub that's very active. There's great restaurants. All of the things that we said we were going to try and deliver in terms of a mixed-use community have really emerged in the West Donlands. And there are many more development sites yet to go. In the East Bayfront, this is about a 55-acre site. This is more or less the same photo I showed you before, which had 2 warehouses and a tennis bubble. You can see there's now half a dozen substantial buildings here, starting on the far left side with the Chorus Entertainment headquarters, and then just immediately next to that, the George Brown Health Sciences building. We were instrumental in negotiating the land deals that brought those users down here. Moving one more over to the right, you see Sherburne Common, which is one of the larger central waterfront parks that have been built in the past decades and is really the anchor, heart of this new community. And then to the right is the Hines Tridel Development Complex. So 2 buildings you see built here, another big hole in the ground for a third, and there's a 4th building that is moving through its planning approvals right now. This, when it is built out, will be several million square feet and have a total in East Bayfront of about 6,000 residents, about 8,000 jobs, and be a major contributor to the waterfront economy. In addition to development, we have been tireless producers of great public realm. This is Sugar Beach, one of the first parks that we completed, helped catalyze some of the interest on sites like the Daniels City of the Arts site, became a fantastic photo op, selfie op for people. And it's free. It's a free park. It's open to everyone, and we've been committed to providing free public access to as many parts of the waterfront as we can. We are also building a state-of-the-art brand new recreation facility, which will go into one of the East Bayfront buildings. It will really be the first integrated community center that's built from day one as part of a larger downtown development. We think that's a wave of the future. It's going to become increasingly hard as we densify to build freestanding community centers, but they're really important to our communities. So finding ways to integrate them into buildings is going to be a critical model for us to follow going forward. We're also committed to transit. This is the Cherry Street streetcar line. This was the first new streetcar line built in 16 years when it opened after the Pan Am Games. It's part of our larger mobility strategy to make sure that we are not building completely car-dependent communities, but that we're in fact giving people mobility choices and options and building complete communities. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of the last 15 years. We haven't stopped. We're still working, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next part of this presentation. And so in front of you, on your tables, are copies of our 5-year plan, which is what we're here introducing today. And there are kind of 3 main components to this 5-year plan, which my colleagues and I will speak to. The first is to complete our funded priority projects, which includes the massive Portlands Flood Protection and Naturalization Project, and David Casturin will get up and speak to that in just a moment. The second is to imagine and deliver on Canada's next generation community, which touches on the Sidewalk Labs topic that was introduced at the beginning, and Meg Davis will speak to that. And then the third is to try and generate some excitement and enthusiasm and funding for some stretch objectives, for some projects that we think have critical public importance, but do not currently have funding, that we are hoping to devote our time and effort to over the next 5 years of finding ways to structure them, finance them, fund them, and get them delivered. And I will be speaking to those after Meg and David. So with that, David? By my standing up here, I'm forcing you guys to stand up here.
Yes, you did.
So sorry.
Go ahead, sorry. It's hard to get around here. Good morning. Try not to fall off the stage. As Chris mentioned, I'm going to speak to our priority projects. And by definition, priority projects are those that are funded. And they're priorities because they're funded. They're not priorities because they're more important than anything else we're doing. But they're projects that we're working on, we're staffed up to deliver, and we're focused on ensuring that these works are completed as we work forward to get into our other aspirational and projects that Meg's going to talk about and Chris later. So first one I'm going to talk about is maybe the most challenging we have. I'd say the most important, but that's only because I'm responsible for it. It's the Portlands Flood Protection Project. It is the second phase of flood protection in the waterfront. The first phase was actually part of the West Don Lands project, Corktown Common, and I'll speak to that in a little bit later. But this project will remove about 290 hectares of lands in the Portlands from the floodplain. Those lands cannot currently be revitalized or redeveloped because they're in the floodplain under provincial regulation. That can't happen. So we will remove the area you see here in blue. I think that's the dinosaur, Ed, if you, yeah, that's the dinosaur according to Ed. There's a hippopotamus too, but we won't show that today. We are looking to, by 2024, take this entire area out of the floodplain. And that involves our completing exactly 23 discrete projects which comprise the Portlands flood protection. This is what it will look like in the future. And really, this is an economic development as much as a climate change and environmental project. We will be creating a new island that we have named, or I think has absorbed the name Villiers Island, a new mixed-use neighborhood community, as Chris mentioned, that will have new homes, affordable housing, retail, businesses, and we're also creating a new river mouth, so renaturalizing the mouth of the Don. And this project goes back to 1989 with the Bring Back the Don initiative. And in fact was one of the four priority projects that was established for Waterfront Toronto when we were founded. So this is a project we've actually been working on since we started some 15 or 16 years ago. And we've been doing that in collaboration with the City of Toronto and TRCA, the Regional Conservation Authority, going through a lengthy and very detailed process of environmental assessments, planning studies, looking at servicing, looking at roads, and doing a due diligence study, looking at acceleration initiatives. How do we deliver this project? It's a $1.25 billion project, which is underway now as we speak. If you drive down Commissioner Street, you'll actually get to see it. There are about 100 acres of new parks, public realm, terrestrial and aquatic habitat. This is as much about the environment and resiliency as it is about economic development. And in fact, the environmental assessment was focused on the naturalization of the Don, creating a new urban fabric for the city, and a number of other goals that we're trying to achieve. As I said, it's underway. So we've actually started excavating the river. The first project out of the gate was the Cherry Street Lake Filling Project. That project is mostly complete for the lake filling. We've got some finishing to do. And it will actually provide the first access at a naturalized shoreline into the inner harbor in the city, apart from the islands, where of course you can get to the lake. But elsewhere in downtown, there are only dock walls that allow you access to the water's edge. Here we will actually have the ability to access the water's edge with kayaks. Still don't encourage anyone to swim in the lake just yet. Maybe in 20 years when the city has completed their wet weather flow projects, you can do that. Although it is a working harbor and we're not going to encourage anybody to go out and swim amongst the big ships. But you will actually be able to access the water's edge and the water itself. The project involves 1.4 million cubic meters of excavation. So it's quite challenging from an engineering perspective. This is a filled area. In fact, the Portlands is all man-made, filled the largest wetland in Lake Ontario starting about 100 years ago. The material that went in there wasn't the greatest, and it was used for industrial purposes for its entire existence. So there's quite amount of contamination that we have to address, and geotechnically, the site's not the best for construction and development. So we're addressing all of that in our engineering and in the work that we're doing with our consultants and contractors, some of whom are here today. So as you can see, I say we've started. We hope to be able to reuse a large percentage of the material that we're excavating. We'll clean it. We do have to actually raise the grades of the Portlands by up to 2 meters in some locations as part of our flood protection work. This is a photo of the Cherry Street Lakefill. As you can see, I mentioned we were mostly complete. This is just the first $65 million project of the $1.25 billion. It started in 2017, and we quickly followed with the beginnings of the Portlands flood protection work thereafter. I mentioned it's a 5-year project. We're looking to complete in 2024, at which point we'll be able to begin developing the new homes, businesses, retail that will comprise the future Villiers Island neighborhood. This is a little animation we've created that will fly us down the Don River from Corktown Common on the right and across the New River Valley, showing what Villiers Island and the Portlands may look like in the future. So as we pass the rail yards and the connection to the Don Valley Parkway, the Keating Channel, we see the new bridge across Commissioner Street and the River Valley. I should note, this is, it's difficult to get a sense of the scale of this project. It is massive. The valley itself is anywhere from 150 to 200 meters wide. It's not that deep, as it happens. It's not a canyon, but it is a very, very large green space. We expect there to be lots of new, as Meg would say, bugs and bunnies in our downtown. That's not the only project we're doing. We have done somewhere between $75 and $150 million of infrastructure investment per year over the last 15 years or so. There's been a very lot of planning, environmental assessments, design and construction, and we are in the process of finishing off that first generation of projects, which we are calling our priority projects. Revitalization of Queens Quay East to match what we've done on the east side or on the west side of Queens Quay. We've got East Bayfront that we're completing servicing roads, sewers, water mains. 2 new parks that our design teams are managing the creation of with the city at York and Queens Quay and at Reese Street and Queens Quay. Both have just begun the design phase. We're working with the Bentway again. We've just completed in the last year the first phase of the Bentway. The second phase is a pedestrian bridge that will cross Fort York Boulevard to provide a better pedestrian and cycling access to the Bentway and across the Gardner frontage. And then we are looking to complete the enhancements that we've started to the Jack Layton Ferry Terminal, and Chris will talk about the future of that project when he gets up. So that work is underway, just some photos of the kind of infrastructure we do. And one of the things we may have been criticized for in the past, certainly not now, has been people wondering what we're doing. Well, what we were doing years ago was doing planning, getting approvals in place, and putting in a lot of underground services that you unfortunately don't get to see. So a substantial amount of our investment are those services that allow for us to actually do the revitalization. The services in the areas that we're working in were sized for industrial and installed many years ago, and certainly aren't suitable for the kinds of uses that are being provided today. So in the top left, we've got a cistern for stormwater collection and reuse in Aiken Place Park. We are constructing the city's first stormwater treatment facility at Cherry Street and Lakeshore. We will collect stormwater from Keating, the North Keating Precinct, West Don Lands, and East Bayfront. We will treat that, clarify that water, treat it, and then put it back into the lake, essentially 99% pure. I'd say you could drink it, except we'd have to chlorinate it, and then we couldn't put it back in the lake. So don't drink it, but it is actually clean. And this is sort of the first part of the city's implementation of their wet weather flow guidelines, which is intended ultimately to capture the combined sewer overflows that happen when it rains and raw sewage, or not raw sewage, but the two sewer systems collapse to each other. The city has a very large project planned, and Mayor Tory a few weeks ago announced that they're going to accelerate that project, which will help to clean up the inner harbor, which when it rains tends to get a little bit contaminated. So we're working on that project. We're working on servicing in East Bayfront, and as I mentioned, we're also working in the bottom right corner on the Jack Layton Ferry Terminal, and when the terminal opens up, there will be the finished new access from Queens Quay to the terminal building, which we hope in the next few years we'll be able to improve as well. I'm now going to introduce Meg to talk about Quayside.
Thanks, David. Building on both Chris and David's comments, I want to just look at some of the things besides sewage treatment plants that we've done in the waterfront over the past sort of 15 years. We've actually pushed the envelope on sustainability. We've had over 24 LEED Gold or LEED Platinum buildings underway or completed. David talked about flood protection. We've already done flood protection in the West Don Lands, which took 250 hectares of land in the downtown out of the flood zone. We've also created a resiliency and innovation framework for sustainability, which raised the bar over the last 15 years in the marketplace. 15 years ago, LEED Gold was quite a stretch, and now it's basically table stakes. So. On the social side, we've also created nearly 600 affordable rental housing units, and we have about 1,000 to go, already some of them underway, both in the West Don Lands and the East Bayfront. And I want to mention that all of those will be connected to our ultra-high-speed broadband that we provide with our partner MetroConnect, Beanfield MetroConnect, so that all the affordable housing units have the same access to the internet as do our market units, so that nobody gets left behind. We've also, as Chris mentioned, created a lot of trails, parks, and public open space, many of them award-winning. And then on the economic side, governments have given us seed capital to invest in infrastructure and public realm. And from that, we've created $4.1 billion in economic returns to the Canadian economy. And we've created over 14,000 person years of employment through those construction projects. So building on those successes, I want to talk a little bit about the next generation community, and this has nothing to do with Star Trek, Next Generation, although sometimes it does feel a little Star Trek-y. We still are faced with significant urban challenges: congestion, climate change. The report that came out this week that Canada is double the global average in temperature rise is quite disturbing. Also affordability. It's very difficult, particularly for our young people in this city to contemplate a future of home ownership here and even rental at times. So faced with those continued urban challenges, we looked at some property that Waterfront Toronto owns. In fact, it's about 12 acres. There's a little bit of city land and a little bit of private land in there, but mostly owned by Waterfront Toronto. And what could we do to push the market again? How could we transform the market and get them to achieve more in sustainability? This really, Quayside presented an opportunity to take that next revolutionary step in city building. So we wanted to take that opportunity, and from that, we issued an RFP. It was a global RFP. We marketed this internationally. We spoke with over 50 companies before we released the RFP. And really what we were looking for was an innovation and funding partner to help us think about those really tough urban challenges and how we could move the dial on some of them. So sustainability and resiliency, we wanted a demonstration project that could show the rest of the world how you could move the dial on sustainability. We also wanted to continue our efforts on complete communities, which I know Chris mentioned, more affordability, more access, more mobility, more cultural and educational opportunities within our communities, and then more opportunities for families of all income and all types. And then on economic development and prosperity, really how do we invest in some of Canadians' amazing companies? You know, we're working, I see Sean Menkes here, we're working with Menkes on our innovation center on the waterfront, creating jobs and investing in Canadian clean tech companies in order for them to find how they can compete on the global stage. And then finally, to bring in some private sector investment. We can't rely on governments for everything in the waterfront. I think, as Chris mentioned, we're only a catalyst, which is a very important role, but the private sector also plays a very important role. And how could we use Quayside to get the private sector to come here and try and help us with some of those challenges? So you can see Quayside, which is the 12 acres shown in yellow, within the designated waterfront area that Chris showed earlier on as one of the largest revitalizations in North America, maybe even the world. And you can see Quayside is at the leading edge of development, new development in the downtown on the downtown east side. So it is actually a very critical piece of land leading into the Portlands, and we need to get it right. I think Doug mentioned we selected Sidewalk Labs as our innovation and funding partner, and really that is our thinking partner to help us come up with a plan for the Quayside lands that will actually move the needle on some of the things that I just talked about. So we started with the fundamentals of our mandate to develop the objectives by which we will assess the Master Innovation and Development Plan that we will be given by Quayside to review. And those fundamentals, those pillar objectives include economic development, affordable housing, sustainability, mobility. All of those things need to be present. And there are lots of opportunities within that range of objectives, but we really focused in on a number of critical objectives that we must have, and you can see in the medium blue there the must-haves. These are things on which if the MIDP delivered by Sidewalk doesn't contain or doesn't deliver for us, we really won't be moving forward. And that includes job creation, moving towards climate positive, affordable housing, mobility, and innovation. Because if this is something Waterfront Toronto could have done on our own, we would have done it without a partner. And then there's some certain things that we actually require our innovation and funding partner to do in order for us to move forward. And those include really deep public engagement, design excellence, data governance, and meeting the law of the land. There will be no opportunities to do anything below that. And then partnering with the local development community, I think, is really important in this case. We did not seek a development partner. We sought a innovation and funding partner, someone to help us do deep research and think about what we could do, but really then to engage the development community. And at the end of the day, this has got to be a great opportunity for the City of Toronto and potentially Canada and the world as a demonstration project, and otherwise, we will not be going forward. So with that, I want to pass it back to Chris, because Quayside, while it's innovative, is only one of many projects that we're looking forward to in our future, and Chris is going to take you through some of the other exciting things we're working on. Where's Peter Halsell for my standing ovation? What happened? Yeah, thank you.
There we go. Okay, you can go this way now, Meg.
Peter emailed me last night. Anything you need me to do tomorrow? And I said, yes, standing ovation, please.
You need more than one person, generally.
Yes, good point.
Thank you, Meg.
It's a one-man show.
And thank you, Peter.
I was lining it up.
Great job.
So I think the last 15 years, we've really gone a long way. I think we've gone from a waterfront where when I started here almost 15 years ago, people said nothing's happening, what's going on? I don't think anyone thinks that anymore. I think it's now a proven neighborhood. It's a proven real estate market. It's viable. and it's on the map. People know it's here and people are coming. So what's next? I think we want to up our game now and say we don't want to just have it be a viable market and be a good neighborhood. Let's try and make the Toronto waterfront one of the top greatest urban waterfronts in the world. So we asked ourselves, well, what would that mean if we wanted to do that? And we did a little research. So first of all, what are the top urban waterfronts in the world? It's not a simple question to answer. There's lots of opinions. Here you just see 3 important lists of best urban waterfronts, but they each represent a very different perspective. So the Condé Nast one, it's really about quality of life. So in many ways looking at it as a place to live. The middle column is Fodor's, which is about tourism, places that are destinations that people go to visit. And then the column on the right is the Project for Public Spaces, which is really about urban design, quality of place. And so we took a scan of these lists and came up with our own list of top 10, and you see them there on the right-hand side. I won't read them off, but we said, okay, these are the 10. We're going to say we'd like to knock one of these out of the top 10 list or get ourselves up to where they are. How would we do that? And we started by trying to understand what made those cities so successful. What were the attributes that made people really want to visit them or live in them or design them or enjoy the spaces in them? And so this is our long list, and I won't go through it in detail, but if anyone wants to ask me about it later, I'd be happy to speak to it. But we looked at characteristics like the physical form of the city, water-based activities, land-based activities, communities, and the environment. And I'm just going to give you a very quick scan of a couple of these attributes just to give you a flavor of what we're looking at. So one of the categories we looked at was the recognizability of the place, the postcard imagery. So Amsterdam, the very distinctive pediments on the tops of those buildings, you recognize those as Amsterdam. Sydney, when you see the Sydney Opera House, you know that's the Sydney waterfront. Singapore, when you see the surfboard building and the Ferris wheel, you know that is that's Singapore, that's modern Singapore. And San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge, we all recognize that immediately, and we have associations of the San Francisco waterfront. Chicago as well, the lakeshore with the views of the skyscrapers behind the lakeshore walk. And Rio de Janeiro, I think everyone recognizes the sculpture looking down over the incredible harbor and the Copacabana beach at the bottom. Many of these cities also have incredible networks of bridges that make them very distinctive. So Stockholm is really a city of islands, so it's all connected by bridges. Amsterdam is a city of canals, also connected with bridges everywhere. Copenhagen, Chicago, the Chicago River, one of the most incredible urban environments in the world. But now with the newly completed Riverwalk, just an amazing set of waterfront experiences. Hamburg, with its warehouse buildings all linked up by pedestrian bridges. Then there's architectural icons. This is one most people think about, and it's interesting. Some people will say you have to have an architectural icon to be a successful waterfront. I don't know that that's true, but it sure helps. So the Opera House in Sydney is about as synonymous with a city as any image could be. Similarly with Singapore, again, the Marina Bay Sands Hotel and the Botanic Gardens there, the artificial trees that actually have greenery growing on them. The pier in San Francisco, which was rediscovered when the Embarcadero Expressway came down, has become a real symbol of the San Francisco waterfront. Another attribute that we noticed was important was a continuous water's edge promenade. And here you see Amsterdam, where all the canals are lined with promenades. Copenhagen, which has a continuous promenade system along the main kind of canal way. Sydney, which has woven promenades under its highways, under its bridges, and past its cruise ship terminals. Singapore, which has the incredible walkway along the Singapore River, which connects up most of the historic neighborhoods of Singapore. Chicago, as I mentioned, the Riverwalk, now completed, an amazing, amazing walk through one of the most dense urban areas, but you're right on the water. Their kayakers are pulling up, boats are going by, and you feel so much a part of that marine experience. And the iconic promenade in Rio de Janeiro. This is many kilometers long of this incredible mosaic, just lines the beach and edges the city. Another category are destination parks, so not smaller parks, but larger parks that actually host a wide variety of activities. So in Sydney, right next to the Opera House, is their Botanic Gardens, Chicago has Grant Park, probably the most well-known, most envied large waterfront parks in the world, product of great planning starting in the early 20th century by Daniel Burnham, who laid out the plan for this, and it took about 100 years before most of Burnham's plan was realized, but it is there now. Millennium Park being sort of the crowning jewel in the puzzle pieces of getting that waterfront together. Crissy Field and the Presidio in San Francisco, and the Botanic Gardens in Singapore. And this park in Hong Kong that attracts huge numbers of people. So that's just a quick little survey of what some of these cities' strengths are. We then listed all of these attributes and how many cities displayed them and tried to see, well, what are the ones that seem to be most consistently emerging as powerful drivers of success. And we obviously don't want to just copy what other cities have done, but I do think we want to learn from what's made them successful. And so we tried to take that list of attributes. We went out to the community. We did several pop-up surveys. We did online surveys to get Torontonians' feedback on what they thought would be important on their waterfront. And what emerged was kind of the beginnings of a consensus around these 4 items. And these are really going to be the basis of our stretch objectives for the next 5 years. And so what you see here is the idea of a continuous waterfront promenade, continuous waterfront walk that would go all the way across the north shore of the harbor from Portland Slip all the way over to Parliament Slip and then connect into the naturalized Don River. And that would be achieved through a series of pedestrian bridges, boardwalks, promenades, some of which we have designs for already from our Central Waterfront Design Competition that gave us Queen's Quay, some of which still need some more work. The second one that we would like to develop is an iconic cultural destination. And so many of those cultural iconic buildings that I showed you have important cultural centers in them. There are some newer ones that have been built in some of these cities as well that you didn't see slides of. But Hamburg now has the Elbe Philharmonic by Herzog and de Meuron, which I think is going to become a world icon of the Hamburg waterfront. The Eye Institute in Amsterdam, these are all incredibly striking, recognizable, unique buildings. We think the Toronto waterfront would benefit from one of those with a real public cultural institution embedded inside it. The third is the idea of what we call destination play, and there are a couple of these that have now been built in the world. They're a little hard to describe, but it's almost like an amusement park without mechanized rides. So it's not a playground in any form that you would think of. It's a whole environment, several acres with very sophisticated and complex play equipment and play environments for children of all ages. Chicago built one right next to the Bean, actually, the Millennium Park. And it is quickly becoming the bigger draw in terms of tourists and visitors than the sculpture. People go there from all over the greater Chicago area because it is just such an amazing environment. I've been there, I've talked to kids who say, I don't live downtown, but I make my grandparents take me here after school every day because I love coming here so much. And I think Canada has a great tradition of kids' entertainment. We produce most of the great children's shows in the world. I think this is a natural fit for our city and something that we hope to find funding for and be able to build. And lastly is the idea of connections, urban connections. Our waterfront has historically not been as well integrated with the rest of the city as some of the others, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the great access points that it has is the ferries to the islands. And we have a plan for substantially improving the experience at the ferry terminal and increasing its capacity and hopefully leading to the potential of creating a mobility network around the harbor and maybe even beyond the harbor that could start to tie this waterfront to the broader city. So those 4 projects are kind of at the core of our future-looking 5-year plan. They're described in the plan. And these are just pictures of each of the ones that I've spoken to. Some of them are more advanced in their thinking and planning than others, but we're going to begin doing that detailed planning work and design work and start to seek partners and relationships that could help us deliver on these projects. And we look forward to all of you helping us with that.
We have time for a few questions, then we're going to turn it over to the audience. You're the experts, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. So first of all, Meg, you have on the desk the 5-year plan, and my question simply is, why is it coming out now? Is it your first door? Do you have annual reports, or how does it work?
Well, so as a public sector agency, we are obligated to do an annual corporate plan as well as a 5-year strategic plan. And it really is a benefit to us because it allows us, it's a rolling 5-year plan. It allows us to adjust to changing environments, changing markets, so that we can continue to achieve our goals and objectives, but also be opportunistic about things that might come up. The Bentway is a good example where we hadn't anticipated a philanthropic gift, and we were lucky to be involved in that. But our rolling plan allows us to incorporate things like that. It also allows us to evaluate ourselves and our progress, and we set goals and objectives and measurements, and the plan allows us to reflect on that. And it also allows us to report to the public. So we are able to be transparent about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing. So that's why we do the annual plan as well as the corporate strategic plan. And it's not our first. We have to do them every 5 years.
Okay. Let's turn to something a little more controversial, and that's the RFP you spoke of for the Funding and Innovation Partner. How many days was that in the market, and did you get a big response internationally, and what is the path forward on that?
So let me start back first and answer that in long form. In 2016, we started to undertake some research with KPMG and Arup on what other projects in the world could give us some guidance on really pushing the envelope on sustainability and affordability, et cetera. And we interviewed over 50 companies to get their input and to see if there was actually a market out there to look at a project like this. Mm-hmm. So we issued an international RFP. It was global. We marketed it internationally. We actually traveled a little bit to promote it. And we did get a lot of interest. We had, I think, 6 or 7 large proposals in the first phase, and so it was a 2-stage process. We shortlisted to 3, and in total, the proponents had the documents and their opportunity to submit at both stages for 159 days. So I know that there's been some discussion in the media about it only being 6 weeks. That was actually just stage 1, okay. And stage 2, which was much longer. And it was a very rigorous process. We had external experts like KPMG, Arup, and others helping us, Canadian Urban Institute. We also had the oversight of Justice Coulter Osborne, who was our fairness advisor to assess the fairness and transparency of the RFP. And we had a steering committee, and I think there's some confusion also in the media. The steering committee was comprised of some senior Waterfront Toronto staff as well as some external thought leaders. And it was that steering committee that helped us select Sidewalk Labs out of a very good field of proponents. It wasn't our board that actually selected Sidewalk. So it was a very rigorous process, and really what we were trying to achieve, as I mentioned before, was somebody to help us fund some research and think about how do we fight climate change, how do we reduce congestion, how do we get deeper and broader affordable housing, and really how do we invest in Canadian clean tech and building innovation so that some of our companies could actually compete on the world stage. So that's really what we were looking for.
Okay, so was the process similar to processes you've done before on RFPs? Was there anything different about it, anything unique, or was it the way you do business?
Well, it was the second longest proposal we've ever done. The longest was the Waterfront Innovation Center. And they're very similar in many ways because really we were picking a partner that we could then envision a project with. We didn't pick the project with Sidewalk, we picked the partner. And through the creation of the Master Innovation and Development Plan, we are creating a project and a proposal that we might choose to go forward with Sidewalk. Right. And similarly with the Waterfront Innovation Center, we chose Menkes as our partner, who was best capable to deliver on this not quite yet defined project. And so with them, over the course of about 18 months, we defined the project. We decided, what percentage of innovation uses, I think it's 60%, that have to be present in the building. And Menkes was able to take all that information and go and test the market to see whether or not there were tenancies out there that could actually do a viable commercial building. And so then received their proposal. So very similar process. It's a process that KPMG uses around the world. In Texas and in Singapore, they use this approach. So we worked with them to try and do this. Very common with very complex procurements.
Okay, and just finally, so what's the process going forward? Where do we go from here?
So Sidewalk is busy working on the Master Innovation and Development Plan now. They will submit that sometime, we hope, this spring for our review. It will be made public. It will go to governments. We will do deep public engagement to get input from the public and the community on it. Our role is to complete a very robust and transparent evaluation process on what we receive from Sidewalk. I mentioned the goals and objectives against which they will be evaluated, and all of that will be shared with the public. And if it meets all our public interest goals and objectives, then there may be a path forward. And if it doesn't, we have the option not to proceed. So I think there's lots of opportunity there, but it really has to be a good deal for Toronto and has to be in the public interest.
Great, thanks so much. So David, you talked a bit about flood protection. So my question, first of all, you've been involved in this. You inherited a problem, obviously. I don't know whether is the fundamental problem high water table, the flooding of the Don. What's the fundamental problem? And at our Energy Committee meeting just 2 days ago, we had someone from the city who used the phrase, we're anticipating the weather is going to get, he was talking about environment, climate change and so on, wetter, warmer and wilder. And to what extent is that a factor in what you're trying to do?
It is a factor, and also inherited an opportunity, not just a problem. And I think that's what this has become, is an opportunity to solve some issues. The primary issue is that in the event of a regional storm, or what's the word? Regulatory flood, regulatory storm event, which is defined as the largest storm ever to hit the Toronto area, and which is specifically Hurricane Hazel. In the event of that storm, water coming down the Don River will overflow the banks of the Keating Channel and flood out the area that I previously showed. That was only part of the issue, however. The other part really stemmed from the beginnings of Bring Back the Don in the 1980s. Right. When the Portlands area was filled, the Don River was channelized into the Keating Channel, which also affects the floodwaters, but is also not a particularly healthy environment for the river to flow through. So we were looking to solve for a number of problems: flooding, the naturalization, so allowing for new habitats, terrestrial and aquatic habitats, and then thirdly, urban development. How do we actually revitalize the space from industrial, post-industrial wasteland to a new neighborhood? And it really is about Toronto's neighborhoods. This is a new neighborhood.
Right. And I think, did you say this is going to be finished in 2024, something like that?
We will be finished this phase of the work in 2024. This phase of the work is specifically flood protection and enabling infrastructure. So we are building the roads or rebuilding the roads that we have to. We are building new bridges that we have to, and we're doing the flood protection and river work we have to. There will be additional parks, additional roads, additional work that will happen as the Portlands develops over the next 25, 30 years. And it will probably take that long. It's a very, very large area. I've only been on the project for 9 years, so I've got a few more to go.
9.
I've only been on it for 9. It actually started in around 2005 with the EA, and this was the second phase of flood protection, which was a priority project for us going back to when we were created. Right. So we've done an EA. We took a little interregnum to do a Portlands Acceleration Initiative over the 2010 to 2015. Completed the EA, then did a due diligence to ensure that we had the right information with respect to geotechnical and environmental and design work. Looked at estimates and costs more closely to give the governments a little more comfort that when we came to them with a number that we'd done enough due diligence to be able to say that we can deliver for that number. Right. And then they looked at that and provided in 2016 and 17 announced the funding for the project, and we started as I mentioned, we started in fall 2017 on the first phase, and last year on the balance of it.
And since I mentioned high water table, I seem to recall Sidewalk Labs saying if they wanted parking on the site, which they don't want, you go down a very short distance and you've hit water, so you can forget that.
Well, you don't have to forget it. You can pay a lot of money to do it. And a lot of the buildings in the waterfront do have parking. The parking generally goes down because of the lack of structural capability in the soil. It goes down to rock. So you have 4 or 5 levels of underground parking, but it probably costs 3 or 4 times what it would cost you to do that anywhere else because of the water table.
Right, right. And maybe this is a dumb question, but soil remediation, is that part of the same deal, or is that totally separate?
No, it's part of the same thing. We're looking at remediating. We have to remediate all of our projects. Essentially, all of the work that we do is in lands that have been filled, which means it's all contaminated. It was all industrial. Now it's contaminated to different levels. For the portlands, we hope to be able to salvage and reuse somewhere between 50 and 75% of the soil that we excavate. We want to treat it as best we can as an asset, not a liability. It's very expensive to truck it off to landfill and dispose of it. So where we can clean it and reuse it, we will.
Okay, thanks so much. So, Chris, what do you think the public needs to know about the work you're doing? And the follow-up to that is I always think if there's 100 people walking by this building, this would be a bad building because King and Bay, I mean, they're going to try to sell you mutual funds or whatever, but never mind. You ask 100 people, what do you know about Waterfront Toronto and what they're doing? What do you think the answer would be, and what do you need to do to get more visibility, to get people to understand more about the good work you're doing?
Well, I think people need to know that we are building one of the great waterfronts in the world.
Right.
We may not be there yet, as per my comments before, but what we've been doing to date is really quite remarkable and to some degree unprecedented. One thing that many people probably don't realize is that the quality of the public realm that we've been building on the waterfront is a subject of academic discussion at design schools across Canada and the United States. Right. So you can go to the Harvard GSD, you can go to U of T, and everywhere in between, and people are looking at us and saying, wow, they're really building their public realm first to attract investment. They're bringing on high quality designers. They're building unique new spaces. They're being innovative. And I think being Canadian, maybe we don't shout about that as much as our partners to the south would do. Right. And maybe we should do more of that. And with the river project coming along that David spoke about, it's going to include some incredible new parkland as well. The wetlands that have to be built as part of the naturalization will be integrated into upland parks that will be at the comparable scale and quality of what we did in Corktown Common, which is, by the way, 100% native plants, one of the few parks that's been planted without any invasives or any non-native species. So we're working in harmony with nature, and we're building places that people and ecology can kind of coexist. The marsh at Corktown Common actually has bullfrogs and dragonflies and all of those things right downtown, and we're going to have that times 10. I've told the designers of the space here that I want to have enough habitat here for a great blue heron to come downtown. Nice. I spend my summers on Cape Cod, and I go kayaking, and I'm always looking for great blue herons, and wouldn't it be amazing to have one of those down here? And I think we can do it, and there's not a lot of cities that have that ability. So I think this waterfront is going to be one of the great unique places to live. And we've brought in some of the best talent from Canada and around the world to help us deliver on that. And I think that's something we really should be proud of, and we should be promoting more. And everyone's going to want to live down here in the next 10, 15 years.
Great. Now you showed us some slides of waterfront cities that have done something that we're hoping to emulate. And by the way, if you're in Chicago, after you take the river cruise, if you can rent a bicycle, and my recollection is you can actually go 22 miles, I think it was, because I've done it twice, with Lake Michigan on one side and one of the best cityscapes in the world on the other, so I'd recommend that. So what did you learn? What are the 1 or 2 or 3 things that you took away from studying what they're doing in Sydney or Chicago or elsewhere?
Well, I think the continuous waterfront walk, as I pointed out, is really pretty fundamental to making waterfronts exciting, accessible, and making them a draw. And I think what we started with the Martin Goodman Trail down on Queens Quay, we really want to make that more and more robust. The Martin Goodman Trail on Queens Quay is the busiest bike facility in Toronto now by a factor of 2, on a street where there were about 40 bikes an hour before we built that project. So there is a huge amount of pent-up demand, and I think that's what you see in the cities who've invested in this. The people come. If you go to the Riverwalk project in Chicago, it is packed with people, even on days when it's not that warm. I was there in October. It was a little chilly. People are sitting outside. There's bars, there's pubs. Everyone is just crowding around the waterfront. They want to be there, but we have to provide the places for people to go and want to be. And I think certainly the eastern waterfront, that's what we've been lacking. But I don't think it's that there's a lack of interest or demand for it. I think if we build it, they will come.
Now, who would have thunk it? But another city you would never think of in a million years, which I've been to 2 or 3 times in the last couple of years, is Detroit, which used to be a place no one would go anywhere near. And they've now got a pretty nice area right along the waterfront. You can walk along, it's completely safe. There's women with baby carriages and so on. They've really done a remarkable job, and it's a city that was, to say the least, down in its luck for about half a century. So,
and I would add that one of the landscape architects who's helping them do that is Michael Van Valkenburg, who's responsible for the design of this river project. So
fantastic.
And Corten Common.
And beyond that, the folks from Detroit have actually been to see us probably 3 times now to look at what we do, how we do it, what our governance structure is. So we've been, Chris mentioned, we are actually being sought from around the world. Last week we met with some people from Australia. We've had the Danish and the Dutch. So they are looking at what we're doing. They're seeing success and wanting to know how to emulate that.
So when I was on my way to Detroit, stopped by the customs guy, immigration guy. He said, "Why are you going to Detroit?" I said, "I'm going to the Art Institute. And I'm actually going to see some of the architecture, which is quite fantastic. They could never afford to take it down, so some beautiful buildings there." He was almost hugging me. The first tours since Cobo Hall opened in 1962. So I recommend it. Okay, final question, Chris, for you is, we need to talk about money here. So where does your dough come from, and how many of your projects are actually funded?
Well, of the 4 that I just spoke about at the end, none of them are funded at the moment, beyond a little bit of money to do some feasibility studies on them. We are very much encouraged by the Matthews donation to the Bentway, and hoping that that is pointing a way to the future where we will start to see more philanthropic, more corporate sponsorship of public realm. It's done more commonly in other parts of the world than it has been in Canada, but we think the time is now for it to start to happen here. So we will be launching a campaign to try and start to bring in partners and bring in donors who want to participate in making this happen. And I think the Matthews are pretty happy with the Bentway and the contribution they were able to make. And that's very much what we would like to provide that opportunity for some others to help us with some of these other projects. Now, some of these are a bit bigger and maybe a little more complex to pull the funding together for, but that's what we're going to try and really focus our minds on over the next coming years.
Now here's a chance for your pitch, and you can look directly at the audience. What are you looking for in partners, other than money?
Oh.
What kind of partner do you want?
I think we want partners who believe in the mission, who believe in the waterfront, and who believe in the public benefits that we're trying to provide, and who believe in this city. I mean, I think the former poet laureate, Pierre Giorgio, used to say, you need to make love to your city. Paul Bedford, who I think is here, likes to cite that line as well. And those are the people we want, the people who want to make love to Toronto and help us do that. I think we're good lovers, but we need some help.
I hope.
There's the soundbite.
I hope children aren't listening to this. Okay, you're cut off. We've had enough of that talk. All right, we're going to give you each 1 minute to say anything you want, make a pitch for anything, the Bentway, the walk, whatever. Any final comments? And then we're going to turn it over to our audience. No? Yes?
Well, for me, I think on our next generation communities, I ask for people's open-mindedness and their patience to see what opportunities might arise out of the proposal we'll get from Sidewalk Labs, and let's see what we can do with it.
Okay.
For me, I think after 15 years, it's really gratifying to see the spaces and places that we've helped to create be very popular, be very active, And for me, I'm looking forward to, what does it look like in 10 to 15 years when these projects are done, and how much better it will be.
Okay, Chris?
Well, I'm really looking forward to being able to take that walk along the water's edge when we've got that continuous walkway, and just move from one fantastic destination to another and feel like, I am on one of the best waterfronts in the world, and this is where I want to be.
Okay, thanks so much. So you can either stand up and declare you want to be a partner, or you can ask a question, or make a brief comment.
Or just write a check.
Or just write a check. Richard?
I'd like to make a sizable contribution.
Thank you, Richard.
From ULI.
Two things that dominate a lot of conversation in city building: affordable housing, both market and deep, but also transit infrastructure. Could you expand on how those ideas work into your five-year plan?
Well, transit, I'm going to leave to Chris. I think on the affordable housing, most people know that we require our developers to do a minimum of 20%. Or set aside land sufficient for 20% affordable rental housing. On Quayside, we're looking for something more. I know also that with Infrastructure Ontario and the West Don lands, we're looking at a new model where the private sector is providing affordable housing without a lot of help from senior levels of government. So we intend to continue on that path to really push for more and deeper affordable housing in all of our projects. Chris, I'll throw transit over to you.
Well, I think you're probably aware that we've been working with the city on the transit study, looking at a waterfront transit network. We're on to the third phase of that study now, which will be bringing some recommendations forth to council very shortly. We're still very committed to the transit. We have a transit deficit in our city because of all the different investments we need to make, so it's very difficult to prioritize. We are still hoping that there will be opportunities for funding, either from the city or maybe from other government partners. We haven't quite pulled it together yet, but we're very actively engaged in still promoting it. I think the BIA on the waterfront has been trying to promote it. Our developers are promoting it, so I think we just need to keep on pushing for it and making everyone realize just what it's going to unlock. The amount of development and urban real estate that's going to be unlocked through that transit is considerable, and it's a worthwhile investment.
And we do have some funding available that would allow us to move design forward, so we'll be looking at doing that just to keep the train moving, if you will.
Good one.
Thank you.
Natasha?
Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I too want to make a donation. So two quick questions for you. So you talked about top 10 examples in the world that you were very much inspired. Could you give me the opposite side? Could you talk about maybe some examples that you don't want to be inspired by? And then my second question, in your slides, you talked about kind of the icon that you want the world to know Waterfront Toronto by. In some cases, you mentioned Opera House in Sydney. What is that one icon that you would like the world to sort of know Toronto Waterfront?
Well, it's a little harder to answer your first question. I mean, certainly there's cities that haven't done very well with their waterfronts. I think a couple of examples I would point to are maybe cities who are figuring it out, who haven't historically done quite as well, but have figured out a way to do something. So I would point to, say, Yokohama in Japan, which was actually their first international port. You know, for centuries, Japan was very isolationist, and one of the first places they allowed foreigners to start doing trade was in Yokohama. So it had a deep history of connection to the sea and to outsiders. Did not have a spectacular waterfront, but they decided that given that history and the role of the water, that they would start investing in. And they built a ship terminal, which you've probably seen pictures of, an incredible architectural icon, the Yokohama Ferry Terminal. It's where all the foreign visitors whose ships dock there now come, and it has really sort of changed the way Yokohama thinks about its waterfront and changed the way the world thinks about the city. I'd say Seattle has been doing the same thing, trying to remove elevated highways, figure out ways to connect themselves better between the downtown and the waterfront, which they had done a poor job of in the past, and had a very industrial waterfront in some ways similar to ours. But recognizing its importance and starting to put some key projects in place to bring it back into focus, bring it back into the rest of the city. So they may be examples that weren't successful, but I think they're going to be successful, and I think they're good models for us to look at too, where you have to take that leap of faith and invest in that thing that maybe hasn't been a part of your urban life in the right way for a long time, but has that potential. Can you restate your second question?
What's the
You
icon?
talked about recently,
Yeah.
like a big icon that you
Yeah.
want the world to recognize the waterfront by.
Well, it's a hard one to answer because I don't know what it is, but I think it needs to be an institution that means something. There have certainly been different things discussed. I think there's an idea of an urban innovation institute floating around out there where we could start to talk about cities, where we could become a think tank about what cities need to be in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
Our mandate was really to make this waterfront a model for 21st century cities. And I think if we could find an Urban Innovation Institute partner who wanted to educate the world about cities and progressive urbanism, and we could find funding to build a great building, maybe a really important piece of architecture that speaks to urban conditions and urban challenges, that would be a great thing for Toronto to be recognized by. And anything like that, I think, needs to have an inclusivity component because we are such a multinational environment. And I think that's something people know about Toronto, and it's something that if we can somehow visually celebrate that, so when the world sees pictures of us, that's reinforced, I think that'd be very powerful. But these are things that have to emerge. We can't just set up a new institute overnight. So again, we need partners who are interested in promoting something that has some meaning and finding a great home for it on the waterfront.
I think to answer that maybe a little differently, not as an iconic building, but if you go to Tommy Thompson Park and you're in nature and you can see downtown, it's actually incredible, the dichotomy of being there and seeing that. And I think with the river, the new river mouth, Toronto is a series of ravines. I think that's pretty unique, actually. And I've been to a lot of, as my colleagues will tell you, I've been to a lot of waterfronts. And it's something that I haven't seen very often, if at all, actually.
I'd also add that, to David's point, it doesn't always have to be a building. If you Google Toronto now, the first picture that comes up are the pink umbrellas. So credit to Chris and his team, that has become an iconic view of Toronto and the waterfront.
Great. I think we've got time for one question, additional question. Anyone have anything?
Ed, you must want to know something.
They're busy writing their checks.
Derek.
It seems like a bit of an odd question. It's not something I ever thought about. When I saw your benchmarking list, one of the things that jumped out at me is of the 10 cities that you guys said were the waterfronts you wanted to emulate, I think 9 or 10 of them had cruise ships as like one of the things that they have. And I never thought of Toronto as a place that had that, and it didn't show up on your list of priorities. I'm just curious, given that those are the cities that you listed and they all had that amenity, is that something you guys ever thought about, or is it something that could be feasible here, or is it just not the climate or not the type of place that we could have that kind of a amenity?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we looked at all these attributes and tried to find ones that would work. And then there are some that are more challenging, and I think the one you've touched on is more challenging. I mean, we're not likely to be a major cruise ship destination. I don't even know if the biggest cruise ships can get through the St. Lawrence Seaway. So we there'd be a natural limit there. The best we could probably hope for is to be part of the Great Lakes cruises, and I think those are actually starting to increase now. More of them are starting to come back to Toronto, and I think they're beginning to grow in popularity. So that might have some legs at some point, but it's a harder one to really focus on right now. I wish we could. It would be very cool. I love the pictures of the giant cruise ships, like wedged into these historic downtown cores. It's really amazing. But
There are many smaller ones, however, that can get to Toronto. And in fact, there are a lot of them that are doing the Seaway, getting to Montreal, and they could come further into the Great Lakes, and I think it could happen.
They do, in fact. I've seen them on Georgian Bay, and it's sort of surprising to see them. But so I think it is a growing industry, and we'll have to see.
We have one final question, then we're going to wrap it up.
Just on your similar, in a way, the benchmarking that you did do, and it kind of goes back to what don't you want to see, and then you mentioned transit deficit. I'm wondering if you looked at the ones that you wanted to be like and overlaid what they have in terms of how
access, so if you have a cruise ship coming in, they can actually go somewhere other than just the waterfront, or people can get to it really easily. I just thought you should maybe benchmark that, the density of public transit related to those waterfronts.
Well, that's a great suggestion, and we tried to assess the sort of connectivity systems. It was a difficult thing to do through research, so if anyone would like to fund a tour for me and my staff to go and visit some of those cities and really try those transit systems, we'd be happy to do that. But no, that's a great point. It's a point of focus that we really want to look at more closely in our next stage of work.
Okay. I like to end on time, and we will. So thanks to, please join me in thanking David, Meg, and Chris.